I will explain the process from the end of the Russo-Japanese War to the Pacific War. I will explain the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the previous article, I explained up to the Washington Naval Conference. In this article, I will explain the London Naval Disarmament Conference and the Imperial Japanese Navy's aircraft carrier strategy. The Washington Naval Disarmament Conference limited the number of battleships that the major naval powers could possess, but it did not place any restrictions on auxiliary ships such as cruisers. As a result, countries began competing to build more advanced cruisers. The Geneva Disarmament Conference, held in 1927, attempted to impose restrictions on this. However, the conference ended in failure due to disagreements between Britain and the United States. In 1929, due to progress in preliminary negotiations between the UK and the US, the countries were called together again, and the London Naval Disarmament Conference was held in 1930. At this disarmament conference, the then Prime Minister, Osachi Hamaguchi, expressed a positive intention. This is because the Great Depression, which began in 1929, also hit Japan hard. He was advocating austerity measures as a policy to get through the Great Depression. For him, the disarmament of the Navy, which consumed a huge amount of tax money, was a very convenient story. The austerity measures he implemented are said to have caused a serious deflationary recession in Japan, and were an economic blunder. The London Naval Disarmament Conference placed restrictions on auxiliary ships such as cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. In particular, the Navy was particularly concerned about Japan's possession of auxiliary ships, which it wanted to be at least 70% of the possession of the United States and the United Kingdom. However, the U.S. demand was for 60% of the U.S. stockpile, which was a significant gap. However, when the U.S. proposed a compromise of 69.75% of the U.S. stockpile, the Navy Department indicated its intention to agree to this proposal. However, the Navy General Staff opposed this compromise. Prime Minister Hamaguchi had the treaty passed in the Diet and ratified the London Naval Disarmament Conference. Even within the Navy, a structure of opposition was formed between two groups, the treaty faction, which supported the treaty, and the fleet faction, which opposed it. The Japanese media and opposition parties criticized the government for signing a treaty that did not meet Japan's hopes, and for not participating in the treaty in part, as France did. Tsuyoshi Inukai of the Constitutional Political Friends Association, an opposition party, raised the issue that the conclusion of this treaty constituted a violation of the Constitution. This is the so-called affair of the Supreme Command interference and violation of rights. The military interpreted this even more broadly. The Meiji Constitution states that the emperor shall command the army and navy. The military has what is called military government and military orders. As the emperor does not actually command the military, ministers advise the emperor on military affairs, and the chief of the general staff advises on military orders. In other words, the Japanese government cannot get involved in military orders, and the intentions of the general staff take precedence. The Navy General Staff was opposed to the ratification of the London Naval Treaty. It is not the government's place to get involved in military matters, and the General Staff's wishes must take precedence. This is the General Staff's policy, which is the Emperor's wishes, and the logic is that it infringes on the Emperor's command authority. The military was made aware that the Emperor's right of command could be used as a political tool. Soldiers were now able to intervene in politics by invoking the Emperor's right of command. The man who paved the way for this military takeover was Tsuyoshi Inukai, who was assassinated by young military officers in 1932, the year he became prime minister. When he was in the opposition, the emperor's right to command the military, which he used as a pretext to attack the government, allowed the military to intervene in politics, and this in turn determined the militarization of Japan. The Washington Naval Conference made it clear that the United States was the Navy's hypothetical enemy. The Navy drew up a battle scenario in the event that the United States became an enemy nation. Both Japan and the United States expected that the decisive battle between the two countries would take place in the waters near Japan. The Imperial Navy had a strategy to attack the American forces with submarines, aircraft carrier task forces, and auxiliary ships while the American Navy was crossing the Pacific Ocean, and to weaken the American military strength before they reached the decisive battle area with the Imperial Navy. The amount of auxiliary ships necessary for this was 70% of the American militaries. For this reason, the Imperial Japanese Navy was firmly opposed to the American compromise plan at the London Naval Conference. From the outset, the Imperial Japanese Navy took a great interest in the aircraft carriers that the British had deployed in World War I. However, Japan lacked the technology to build its own aircraft carriers in the 1910s. However, at the time, the Anglo-Japanese alliance was still in force, so Japan asked Britain to send an air mission, and in 1921 Britain sent a military technical mission to Japan. The technical group provided guidance on the construction technology for aircraft carrier decks in Japan. They also taught the pilots how to land on aircraft carriers. The construction of aircraft carriers in Japan was greatly aided by the United Kingdom. The first aircraft carrier to be built in Japan was the Hosho. The Hosho was completed in 1922, and was the first aircraft carrier to be built from the design stage as an aircraft carrier. As I mentioned earlier, the Imperial Navy's intention in using aircraft carriers was to use them in a supporting role, to cross the Pacific Ocean and reduce the strength of the American Navy that was coming to Japan. The Navy was committed to fleet battles, as it had been in the Battle of Tsushima during the Russo-Japanese War. Heihachiro Togo, who fought in the Battle of Tsushima, also strongly supported this theory. His influence in the Navy was tremendous. The person who was critical of this fleet decisive battle strategy was Isoroku Yamamoto, who was the commander-in-chief of the Navy at the start of the Pacific War. He had experience working in the U.S., and he was well aware of the difference in national power between Japan and the U.S. He held key positions in the Naval Air Force and worked hard to enhance the Naval Air Force's capabilities. The Navy drew up plans to build super-large battleships of the Yamato class, but Yamamoto and Onishi, who planned the kamikaze attacks, strongly opposed the idea. Yamamoto wanted to convert the Navy's main force from battleships to aircraft carriers and fighter planes. Yamamoto is reported to have said, "Future naval battles will not be battles between warships. Before the artillery battle begins, the warships will be attacked by aircraft. From now on, warships will become useless. We should build up our air force without building any more warships." However, traditional fleet-based strategists argued that battleships could not be sunk by fighter attacks. In the end, the Navy decided to build huge battleships of the Yamato class and 30,000-ton class aircraft carriers. Yamamoto was convinced that aircraft would become the main force of the Navy in the future, but there were few people in the Navy who agreed with him. The crushing victory of the Battle of Tsushima in the Russo-Japanese War had hardened the thinking within the Navy. However, this was also the case in other countries. The true strength of aircraft power was not recognized until the Battle of Malaya, when Japanese fighters sank 2 new British battleships. Next time, I will be explaining the Second Sino-Japanese War. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel and press the like button.